Some of you who were involved in HAT 5 years ago will remember Dr. Robert Johnson's talk to us then about what Putin wants. Naturally, with current events, we thought it was a good time to revisit the topic, and we're glad he's agreed to talk to us again. Dr. Johnson is a professor emeritus in the history department at U of T. He is an expert in Russian and Soviet history. I guess looking over his page, I found he's published on topics from late 19th through to early 21st century. So we're very grateful to him for sharing his expertise on this very timely topic with us. Bob, you want to take it away?
Well, my remarks will be very informal. I think I'm going to start out with the question of where is this thing going and where might it end? Because I think that's the burning question of the day. But I want to leave a lot of room for questions where we can get into the issues of how we got to this situation in the first place. But to frame the discussion, I'd like to begin with two quotations. The first one comes from the president of Ukraine about 2 weeks ago in an interview with the editors of The Economist magazine, in which they asked him, "What would you consider victory in this war?" And his answer was to say, "Victory is being able to save as many lives as possible. Our land is important, yes, but ultimately it's just territory." So that was 2 weeks ago. 2 days ago, the US Defense Secretary, visiting in Kiev and having just spoken with the president of Ukraine, made a statement about the US's goal in this conflict, in which he said, "We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine." In other words, bring Russia to its knees. So I think the question I will circle around to and come back to is, what are the different parties to this conflict hoping to achieve? And what possible outcomes can we imagine? And what are the implications for the rest of us? Having said that, I'll go back to the question of Mr. Putin. If you have any recollection of the things that I would have said 5 years ago, I think I would have predicted that he could never undertake the kind of campaign that he's now undertaken. I was flabbergasted, I have to tell you. And I think if you're trying to think of me as an assessor of what's going on, you have to weigh into that I was a very bad prophet in this present situation. I was sure, as President Zelensky was, that Putin was much too smart to undertake the kind of campaign that he undertook on the 24th of February. I thought it was all bluff, and I thought that he was, yes, a very ruthless megalomaniac, but a very clever one who planned his strategies very carefully and systematically, and would not put himself and his country at risk of serious losses. And this was entirely incorrect. He made the most colossal mistake that any leader has made since, I would say, George W. went into Iraq. And on the scale of things, this is a much bigger mistake than George W.'s mistake. It was preposterous. And it was evident to most people in other countries from the very beginning that this was not an effort that had any prospect of producing a good outcome for the Russians. What Putin did was very much against his national interest, and as it has turned out, all of the things that he might have hoped for have come out exactly opposite from what he thought. He was counting on the Ukrainians to turn against each other. He seems to have believed that there was a well of pro-Russian feeling in parts of Ukraine that were not under Russian control, not Donetsk, not Luhansk, but the other heavily Russian-speaking areas in the east of Ukraine. Instead of that, the whole population of Ukraine, which historically has been very divided, and I'll say more about that if you would like to talk about it later, has closed ranks in resisting the invasion. And for the moment, at least, there's a great sense of national unity and resistance. And President Zelensky, who looked like a rather weak figure, a comedian from television, after all, what kind of president is that, has shown qualities that were nothing short of heroic. So that was one expectation that Putin started with that certainly hasn't been borne out. I think Putin probably hoped that in a crisis such as this, the NATO alliance would be divided into bickering and stalling and would have very little to say or do, and therefore whatever Russia might undertake would go ahead rather smoothly. And of course, as we've seen, it's exactly the opposite. NATO has closed ranks, and not just NATO. Countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, that are outside of NATO have started sending support to Ukraine. Sweden and Finland are starting now to make overtures about joining NATO. Germany has increased its military budget and has changed its policy about sending heavy weapons. This was a very recent change, just in the last week, sending heavy weapons to Ukraine. And the sanctions that have been posed on the Russians have been very powerful, although not crippling. So if Putin was hoping that he could play the United States and NATO off against each other, that certainly hasn't occurred. The third thing that Putin seems to have believed is that his armed forces, the budget of which had been doubled during the years of his presidency, armed forces that had been supposedly reformed and reconstituted and upgraded, he thought that they constituted a really powerful military machine that would sweep across Ukraine in a matter of days. And I think you probably all have heard the stories about how the column that was approaching Kiev, the soldiers were actually carrying their dress uniforms in their kit, in the expectation that they would be marching in a victory parade within a few days. Instead of that, the Russian army has proved itself to be ineffective, even incompetent, and has shown many of the weaknesses that foreign analysts were talking about more than 20 years ago, before Putin became the president. It seems as though the army is riddled with corruption, that its supply networks have been compromised so that, for example, the tires on the tanks were made of inferior rubber that wouldn't hold up. And therefore they had to stay on paved roads. They couldn't go into open territory. The communications networks were not secure. Military analysts are astonished by this. Many in the West had expected that the Russians would be putting up a better show of force than they have. And I think for Putin, it has been a failure of military force and a failure of intelligence, with the result that the assault against Kiev had to be abandoned, as we all know. The losses, let's see, the number of battalion task groups that were sent in the initial campaign across all of Ukraine was 120, which represented an army of something over 100,000 coming into Ukraine. And of those 120, 80 of the BTGs have been significantly weakened or disabled. The Russian casualties, let me go on a slight tangent here and say, I don't trust any of the figures of casualties in a war. Each side is always going to claim that the other side is losing 10 times as many troops or civilians as its own side. Ukrainian sources claim that they have killed 10 generals. it may or may not be so. Some NATO analysts say that there have been tens of thousands of military casualties in the Russian forces, military deaths in the Russian forces. We can't conclusively confirm any of those numbers. What we can confirm are the numbers of disabled tanks. And I can't give you a statistic on that, but it was a spectacularly large number of tanks that that have been knocked out in the first weeks of the war, especially in the assault towards Kiev. So from the Russian point of view, this whole thing has been a total disaster. It has made Russia into a pariah state. It has led many in the world to regard Russia's leadership as war criminals. Although I must say that the likelihood that they'll ever be punished as war criminals is not very great. Russia is becoming a pariah state. And then indirect effects, Russia will become more dependent on its senior partner to the east, which is China, in ways that I'm sure is not very much to Putin's liking either. So it's been a fiasco from Putin's point of view. But this doesn't settle the question of where are we going, what's going to come down the road next in the course of this conflict. I'll have to say that we have a David and Goliath story here that's a little bit different from the biblical one. David stepped forward with his slingshot and he inflicted a very powerful blow against the giant. But instead of simply dropping dead, the giant is now staggering about, stamping on everything in sight. Not dead, maybe not crippled, maybe even capable of getting a second wind. And the result of this is that when we look at these three conditions that have been so much against Putin's interest so far, it's not impossible that any or all of them could, in the course of time, be reversed. If we look at NATO, for example, it's certainly true that the sanctions are biting, causing dislocations of an economic sort in patterns of trade and finance. What will happen if Germany takes the next step and starts to reduce its dependence on Russian oil and especially gas is impossible to predict with any certainty, but it could have tremendously disruptive effects on the German economy. And over time, it could lead to popular dissatisfaction that might be expressed at the polls. In the case of France, one of the issues in the election last weekend was French dissatisfaction with Macron's position on Ukraine. And Marine Le Pen was certainly saying, step back from this, France has no business in Ukraine and so forth. And she got, what was it, 42% of the presidential vote. Not enough to put her into office, but certainly enough to make Macron aware that not all of the French population is happy with his line of policy. If the sanctions on Ukraine produce inflation, if they produce shortages of goods, if they produce a slowdown in economic growth, put people out of work, dissatisfaction could come along, and this could maybe, in the somewhat longer term, work to the Russians' favor. On the ground, we don't know the strength of the military forces that Ukraine is presently disposing. This is part of the problem of getting most of your military information from one side. We get very positive reports from Ukrainian sources, but verifying them for people like us is pretty difficult because we don't have an independent way of counting. And as a result, most of the positive reports that they send about Russian casualties or the negative reports about their own may need to be weighed rather carefully. And it's not impossible, especially now as the conditions of the early spring start to change, that a Russian army moving across eastern Ukraine in the way that it's been doing can do better than the task force that was sent against Kiev. One of the conditions that hasn't gotten a lot of play is the spring thaw. There's a Russian word for this, Rasputitsa, which describes a season that lasts anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, and farmers on our prairie will know it very well, when the frozen soil turns to mush for a while. And if you make the mistake of taking your tractor out into the field, you can get mired up to the axles. And the same is true of tanks. Little by little, over the course of April and May, the soil dries out and it becomes possible to plow the fields, or it becomes possible to drive tanks across them. And the mobility of tank warfare, which the Russians have relied on pretty heavily, might possibly improve. As for the unity of the Ukrainians, my reading of it right now is that it's absolutely solid. But I have to say that historically, that is to say, over the last, 7 years, 8 years since the Maidan Revolution, it's been very much back and forth, that the different factions, which are religious, they are ethnic, they are linguistic, and they are ideological, that have in the past divided Ukrainians, are still there. And at any point, they may resurface. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry, I thought I had turned that off. So at any rate, today's unity isn't a done deal. And I think, going back to my quote from Zelensky at the beginning, if he or some of the people of his government tried to reach some kind of a ceasefire that was perceived as a compromise, some of the factions that are now united behind him might decide that he was selling them out. Ukrainians are not sure at this point, and I think Zelensky himself may not be sure how far they want this war to go. Is this supposed to be driving back the Russian invaders to the status quo ante, which would leave Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea in Russian control? Or is it going to liberate Donetsk and Luhansk? Or is it going to go all the way to liberate, and I use that word with great caution, Crimea? There are definitely some in the Ukrainian political spectrum and in the Ukrainian military who are determined to go all out and who are talking about victory in terms of bringing the Russians to their knees. And like some in Western countries, talking about regime change, talking about getting rid of Putin. He's the villain, after all. He's the war criminal. He's the megalomaniac. Therefore, regime change is the only thing that's going to fix him. I think among the Ukrainians, I suspect that there's a lot of disagreement, or perhaps I should say nuance, as to how far the war should be taken if it continues to go in their favor. And I don't exclude the possibility that disagreements are going to arise. So unfortunately, my short-term prediction is that we're into an uncertain situation that looks very much like a stalemate. I don't see a prospect of victory for the Russians, but I don't see the Ukrainians agreeing on what would be a victory in their terms. I think the victory that Zelensky spoke about in that quote that I posted at the beginning, a victory that was saving lives and not so concerned about territory, is certainly one that I personally would find more reasonable and hopeful. But I believe that both among the Ukrainians and among their foreign allies, there is emerging a different attitude, all the way to the point of some in Washington and some in some of the NATO capitals thinking that this is the time to get rid of Putin. To my mind, this would be a catastrophic mistake for a number of reasons. And yet the quote from the US defense minister sort of points in that direction. And there are a couple of other recent quotes from British counterparts that I'm going to try to bring up on my other screen here and offer you for a moment. British defense minister talked about Russia as a cancerous growth that must be removed. That was the defense secretary, Ben Wallace of the UK. The foreign secretary said the Russian forces must be pushed out of the whole of Ukraine, but she didn't say whether that meant Crimea, whether that meant Luhansk and Donetsk, or whether it meant the territories that the Russians have now moved into as part of their invasion. I think, according to some of the reports last week, Ukrainian forces have started to shell Russian supply lines and supply dumps across the border into Russia itself, which, if it's true, would represent a significant escalation and one that is provoking Russia in a way that is, to me, rather scary. And I think most of all, I have the idea that crazy as Putin is, it's never been smart to keep poking him in the eye with sticks. There's a long-standing disagreement among foreign policy experts going back to the early 1990s about the wisdom of expanding NATO to the east. And I'm sure many of you have seen some of the controversies just in the last few days. John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago has been one of the most outspoken in this respect, saying that the West bears great responsibility for this current conflict because it inflamed it by inappropriately offering NATO membership to Ukraine, and before that, by widening to the east, by bringing in Poland and Romania and the Baltic states. It's a point of view that was shared by an incredibly diverse number of foreign policy experts that included Henry Kissinger, the late George Kennan, whom I regard as the wisest of all of the foreign policy figures that the United States has had in the whole of the 20th century. Richard Pipes, the ultra-conservative Harvard historian, and as late as 2008, when the issue of Ukrainian membership in NATO was put forward at the Bucharest conference, it was initially opposed by both France and Germany, although with the efforts of the Bush administration, they fell into line and supported a resolution saying ultimate membership for Ukraine was a good idea. I don't think it was a good idea. I don't think it was ever a good idea. I think that when we think about how the conflict could end, Zelensky himself has said he's willing to accept the idea of a neutral Ukraine that was not part of NATO and would renounce any ambition of ever joining NATO. But that's not what the war is about at the moment. And we don't know what's going to happen from that. So I think I've tossed out some of the issues that are burning at the moment. My prediction at this stage is that there isn't a preponderance of force on either side. If the Ukrainians continue to get solid weaponry and incidentally, not only weaponry, but intelligence from Washington and the NATO allies, they will at least hold their own and maybe more than hold their own. I don't see it reaching the point where they would be able to drive all of the Russian military forces out of territorial Ukraine, much less out of Crimea. But maybe we should stop there. I think we could talk, if the questioning wants to pursue it, about Putin and what might have been on his mind. We could talk about the Ukrainian divisions, or we could go back in history and talk about what is Ukraine, what is Russia, because that, I think, has gotten a little bit muddled up in the way these stories have been presented in our daily press. We tend to live from headlines and not think about where all of these things have come from. So with that, perhaps I'll just open the floor to your questions or comments, and we'll take it from there.